We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Well, hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is John Hayes, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar on the School of Public Policy's most recent publication entitled To Coerce or Not to Coerce, Assessing Policy Strategies to Regulate Small-Scale and Artisanal Mining in the Andes. I would first like to thank all in attendance. We have guests joining us from all over the world. And on behalf of the Extractive Resource Governance Program, also known as the ERGP, we would like to thank you for joining us today for this 1-hour webinar. I am the research coordinator of the ERGP at the School of Public Policy, which for those of you that might not know, is one of several programs within the SPP. We are a Canadian center specialized in resource governance with a focus on the subsoil extractive industries, particularly oil and gas and mining. Our work at its core is about policy analysis, meaning it is a collaborative, interdisciplinary program drawing on a global team. We have Canadian foundations from our base in downtown Calgary, but we draw from an expert roster from across North America, Latin America, and Africa, across the academic, government, policymaking, and private sectors. Our roster includes international leaders in research, training, and in advising. Today, we are discussing resource politics and policies in artisanal and small-scale mining. The regulation of this small-scale industry, which is adjacent to a much larger scale mining industry, is handled differently across countries. Although the challenges posed by artisanal and small-scale mining are often quite similar, state responses vary from cooperative strategies to coercive strategies. Today, our panelists will discuss the question of which approach is most effective in addressing the challenges posed by artisanal and small-scale mining, and address some of the specific approaches taken by different jurisdictions in South America. After their presentation, we will have a question and answer period for about 15 to 20 minutes. I will be presenting some of the questions to the speakers that you all will be putting into the question and answer box feature that you have. So please, as any questions pop up, feel free to just type them into the Q&A box, and I'll be sure to sift through them and choose a few depending on how much time we have left at the end. So first, I'd like to introduce our speakers, and then I will hand it over to them. Dr. Zoraida Toledo Orozco is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research at Tulane University. She is a specialist in comparative politics, and her research focuses on informality, resource governance, and state-society relations in Latin America. Outside of academia, she has led projects for the improvement of practices in small-scale and artisanal mining and for transparency in the gold supply chain. She obtained her PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia. Our second author today is Dr. Catherine McKiernan, who is an operations research analyst for the United States Air Force, a former postdoctoral fellow also from the Center for Inter-American Policy and Research at Tulane University. Dr. McKiernan is an operations research analyst with the Air Force, and her research focus has been on distributive politics and participatory institutions in Latin America. Her work uses a variety of methodological approaches, including formal theory, survey experiments, and regression analysis. She obtained her PhD in political science from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Thank you very much to both of you, and I will hand it over to you.
Go ahead, Kate, you're muted.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm Kate McKiernan, and Zerai and I are so excited to share this work with you on our project To Coerce or Not to Coerce, assessing policy strategies to regulate small-scale and artisanal mining in the Andes. So we'd like to begin with a definition of what exactly is small-scale and artisanal mining, which we will refer to as ASM. These are extractive activities using rudimentary or semi-mechanical technologies in order to extract resources. These are commonly informal activities. That is, unlike the large-scale corporate mining counterparts, they often occur outside of a state regulatory framework. However, much like large-scale mining, these activities grew exponentially during the commodity boom in the 2000s. It is huge in the global South and the Andean region and has provided economic freedom and resources to people in rural areas. In fact, more than 44 million people globally are involved in artisanal small-scale mining. Despite this, these reactions do not occur without great environmental cost. This photo is from the Amazon, where the blue represent informal mining camps. And it's evident from these photos alone, the extent of deforestation, pollution of the soil and the air, and mercury contamination that ASM helps produce. In fact, over 18,000 hectares in the Amazon alone have been lost to deforestation as a direct result of ASM activities. In addition to these environmental consequences, we see rises in exploitation and violence along ASM communities. That said, this is an activity that has a huge number of participants and is incredibly important to the economy, but that comes with a lot of challenges that states are forced to address for people and the environment. So why is it so difficult to regulate ASM activities? We highlight 3 reasons. First is that these activities are incredibly varied. This high degree of variation is geographical. Where is it occurring? It also deals with the type of extraction. Are we seeing extractive activities in rivers, ground, rocks, the complex processes of extracting resources? And it's complex in its extraction and its structure, involving full-time workers, seasonal workers, and temporary workers. Second, these activities tend to occur in places with significantly less state reach and oversight. The state knows less about what is happening in these far corners. They tend to have lower levels of state capacity to view, gain knowledge, regulate, and enforce activity. And finally, we see differences in relationships between the state and the informal miners that affect the way that enforcement of regulations can and does occur. So this is not just a left-right issue, but rather the structure of the state, the structure of the miners come together to change the way that we see these relationships occur. So how can we assess whether states' regulatory strategies and enforcement capabilities are working? First, we can think about this issue of complexity and variation. And many have argued that to assess this, we can think about the question, do policies consider the different actors, the different mining deposits, the different types of labor regimes, all of which helps us think about, well, does the regulatory policy effectively deal with the complexity of the activity? Similarly, when thinking about the issue of lower levels of state presence in ASM areas, we can ask questions like, did the policies incentivize the creation of offices, bureaucracy, or personnel capable of regulating activity? What does the policy enforcement do to deal with and address low state strength? However, we know remarkably little about how to assess whether enforcement is able to account for these state-society relations that are actually very central to whether enforcement is successful. This is the gap that we are attempting to address in our paper. So how does the state enforce new regulatory policies? We highlight two main strategies. The first are coercive strategies. These are strategies where the state is acting swiftly and with a heavy hand to enforce policies, implement policies, and force acceptance of policies. On the other hand, states can take more cooperative strategies. These are strategies designed to work alongside the informal miners to design policies that will be complied with. This leads us to ask the question, are coercive strategies effective in increasing ASM's compliance with regulations? That is, are these popular, heavy-handed strategies effective in doing what they claim to do, which is taking these actors and making them comply? We argue that the state actually benefits more for cooperative than coercive strategies. This is fairly counterintuitive. Coercive strategies are short-term gains, they signal strength, they signal capacity, and they should be able to occur swiftly and appease multiple actors. While cooperative strategies are longer term, they rely on working with miners, designing policies together, potentially giving things up, and potentially running into issues of time horizons when we come to issues of re-election. Can they stay in power long enough to make cooperation work? Despite this, we argue these cooperative strategies are more effective precisely because focusing on state-society relationships builds trust that facilitates successful enforcement. How do we do this? In order to do this, we use a sequential model that isolates the interactions between the state and the artisanal miners. We focus on these two actors rather than introducing large-scale mining, environmental interest groups, etc., because they are the core decision makers, the state with designing and enforcing policies, and the small-scale mining community in determining how to respond to regulation. When we do this, we are treating the miners not as disparate individuals who act individually, but rather as communities that vary in their organizational structure and have a system for creating a unified approach in responding to regulations. So in our sequential model, what we are doing is looking at these two unique actors and considering how one responds to the other, allowing for essentially a dialogue where what the miners do does not occur in a vacuum, absent knowledge of what the state does. What does this look like? For the sake of an hour webinar, we won't go into many details with the math, but we will provide you a picture of more or less what to expect. The top, a priori, miners are organized. They have some power of organization, ranging from none to the most organized possible. And the state knows this when designing policies. So now it is time to enforce. And we're going to start on the left with what happens if the state coerces the miners, this intuitive short-term strategy. The state coerces the miners are left with one decision. Do they acquiesce and give in to the new enforcements, or do they fight, resisting new regulations and making it difficult for them to be enforced? On the other hand, the state can take this cooperative strategy. Here we see more possible decisions. In response to cooperation, the miners can choose to comply, therefore showing successful enforcement, or not to comply. Should the miners choose not to comply, the state is then left to ignore, reverting to the status quo, or go back to their alternate strategy of coercion, leading the miners to acquiesce after finally being coerced, or to fight back further. Next slide. So given that we have this information, what interests do we highlight? First, when talking about the state, we're really focused on their ability to extract rents from the mining community. This is not necessarily all about taxes, but rather rent extraction is a proxy for state capacity and control and the ability to do so. And they're also interested in minimizing the cost associated with coercing the miners, trying to reduce what they have to do to gain compliance. On the other hand, the miners are most interested in maintaining the status quo. They want to minimize their profits lost to the state, which is a proxy not for giving up money, but rather for giving up autonomy. They want to be able to continue to exercise their rights to mine in the way they have historically. Now, this table has a lot of information, and we're not going to talk about it all. Rather, it's to show that we have different strategies the state and miners can take that affect their utility. And I'm going to highlight two. The first is, when is the state in its best case scenario? The best thing to happen for the state would be the state coerces the miners acquiesce, and the state gets everything they want. They have complied, they've paid a little bit to coerce, but otherwise they are fully showing their strength. But this is really bad for the miners. They're giving up their autonomy, and they're already paying what they've paid into having a cooperative structure. On the other hand, the best case for the miners would be if the state chose to cooperate, but then when they chose not to comply, the state ignores them. In this case, the miners are doing great. They have the status quo, less the cost they've already paid into their organizational structure. But the state is really struggling. Nothing has changed, but they've paid a fee for attempting to cooperate and failing. They are worse off than before. So what happens when we solve this model, given this full set? We have four main insights that we'd like to draw your attention to for the case studies. First is that artisanal miners are always going to fight coercive strategies as long as they might win, unless the state is already so strong that any attempt at coercion will immediately crush the miners. The miners will come back against coercive strategies. Second, if the state attempts to cooperate and the miners reject that cooperation, the state will always revert to coercion. That cost they've paid for failed cooperation is sufficiently high that they will not go to ignore the miners, giving the miners their best case. Third, the miners would rather cooperate than fight a coercive state. Cooperation, they give up some autonomy, but when fighting a coercive state, just as we can't guarantee the state will always win, the miners won't always win. They are forced to deal with this level of uncertainty that can radically change the outcome. And finally, the state ultimately gets a higher utility from cooperation, even though they have a reduced level of control over policy and policy enforcement. They're going to get higher enforcement over a suboptimal policy that does not necessarily do full enforcement than their ideal policy because of how costly coercion actually is. This is our key insight that we think about the most, because it shows how, faced with two non-ideal situations, the state is objectively better taking a loss to get enforceable policy than having an ideal but harder to enforce policy on their hands.
Thank you, Kate. So to test the model we just presented, we chose two country cases that are dependent on commodities, Bolivia and Peru. In Bolivia, mineral revenues account for around 44% of Bolivia's total export and 52%, more than 52% of Peru's total exports. And these are also two cases where miners are organized and have a high mobilization capacity. Hence, these are cases where we wouldn't expect them to comply. On top of that, during the 2000s, in both cases, the states put forward reforms to increase regulation to a smaller scale and artisanal mining. So for this study, our fieldwork took place between 2015 and 2017, and it mostly focused on the regions with the largest informal mining production, particularly around gold, which was the hottest commodity in the market. And we target the most important regions, La Paz, rural La Paz, and Madre de Dios, which were also the main targets of state regulation. Additionally, in capital cities, we conducted interviews with policymakers, and I updated part of the information with further interviews with them in 2020. So let's dig into the case studies. Let's start with Bolivia. Smallest scale and artisanal mining in Bolivia is present in 4 regions. Miners are organized in cooperatives. These are associations that share the expenses, although during boom times, when mineral prices are high, they tend to hierarchize. Most of the gold cooperatives, as I mentioned, are in rural La Paz, and estimates say that there are more than 2,000. And in each cooperative, their members can go from 10 to 1,000. The political arm or the organization that represents them are federations. Federations who operate at the regional and national level make collective decisions about their miners' activities and other political matters. They have a great power of mobilization. And although they have had political representation since the 80s, it is in the 2000s that this power increments when President Evo Morales enters office and recognizes the role of mining cooperatives to the economy and recognizes this role in the constitution. However, in 2009, Morales puts forward this reform to increase the state control over minerals, increase taxation, more controls to the supply chains, and more socio-environmental regulations. And in response, the miners went out to the streets to protest. 2 new drafts are written in 2012 and 2013, and this time the reform conceded a little bit and offered the creation of new offices to help miners. However, once again, the miners opposed the draft because they want to have a say in the reform, and in fact, they asked for extra benefits. The state, and then the Bolivian state at the time, faced a lot of pressure from the media to coerce the miners to stop the protest. But nevertheless, the government of Evo Morales decides to continue negotiating with them. The miners at the time continue with the pressure, radicalize their protests, and in fact, we will see that they block some of the main streets. The president, Morales, asked them to come back to the table. It says that it won't accept the request, but that they are invited to be part of the writing process, that the outcomes will be consensuated. Miners accept and go back to the negotiation table. I was talking to one of the heads of the federations in Bolivia, and I asked them, why do you do that? If you have such a high contention power, why do you decide to sit and commit to this negotiation? And he said, it is better to have someone to talk, to negotiate with, even if it's a bad deal. You always have tomorrow. And I want to give a summary of what they negotiated and what were the trade-offs, but I want to do it in comparative perspective. So I'm going to present first the case of Peru. In Peru, smaller scale and artisanal mining is present in 20 out of 24 regions of the country. And different estimates say that there are around 500,000 miners in Peru. Miners in Peru work in groups, sometimes in cooperative or some other collaborative forms. And they are organized in associations that, as in the case of federations, work at the regional and national level. With similar goals as in the case of Bolivia, since 2010, during Alan Garcia's government, the Peruvian state passed laws to increase regulation, actually to begin regulating small scale and artisanal mining. The state at the time considered it as a harmful activity. And the following president, Ollanta Humala, strengthened those policies by adding more socio-environmental regulations and more strict controls, but it paired this regulation with coercive implementation strategies. For example, the state established heavy bureaucratic requirements, started trials against informal miners, and put forward many police and military raids in the mining camps. Worse, at the beginning in the legislation, informal mining was conflated with illegal and criminal activities. So Ultimately, in the case of Peru, the state in these policies aim to deter the expansion of the activity. So as you could anticipate, these laws and implementation strategies were not discussed at all with the miners, who, by the way, in Peru cannot participate in politics as a sector. So in response to these regulations, to these coercive implementation strategies, informal miners in Peru went out to the streets to protest. There are many episodes of simultaneous blockades and strikes in different mining regions. And in these protests, they pointed clear mistakes of the law. For example, they say that the law ignored local conditions. They were expensive. They did not apply to all the cases. Many of the mineral deposits could not follow the rules. If you were working in such deposit, you could not follow those rules. Or worse, in many cases, the state did not have offices close by. So even if the miners were interested in complying, could not do so. And in fact, despite all the costs, all the money spent in these raids, by the end of this first phase, less than 1% of miners legalized their activities or even improve their practices. So to increase compliance and against this backlash, President Humala changes the deadlines to formalize and improve your practices, but also passes more executive decrees to authorize more police and military raids. And at the time, it seemed that they were in fact reducing, at least temporarily, the number of informal miners. But the issue was that the raids were also tackling informal miners in the process of legalizing their activities, and they tackled other vulnerable groups. For example, informal traders that were nearby, other local communities, and they ended up increasing the level of violence in mining towns and the level of conflicts at the local level. So the policy mistakes were then obvious. Nationally, the laws made legislation very difficult, if not impossible, because they were not accounted for local conditions. And on the ground, the state could not even identify or separate actors. On the contrary, it ended up hurting others. And at this point, we will see that some national officials, majors, regional governors in mining regions joined the protest, which against central state policies, which further increased the opposition to the laws. So at the end, the government had no choice but to derogate the laws. So what were the outcomes and trade-offs of each strategy? It is obvious that there's no winner here. There's no evident winner here, but I think by seeing it in comparative perspective, we can learn some lessons. So let's see the case of Bolivia. First of all, thanks to the negotiations, the protests and the violence reduced, especially in comparative perspective, especially in comparison to the rest of the neighbors in Andean countries. Also, miners accepted the implementation of some regulation, for example, safety measures, and accepted the creation of other institutions that could trace production and mineral commercialization. The trade-off for the state was that the royalty increase, which was one of the goals of the law, was postponed. And the miners kept a say over new regulation, which means that they kept a political platform that allowed them to defend their interests and negotiate benefits above other groups of society. They negotiated also the creation of certain institutions, for example, to access credit and technical help. How about in Peru? In Peru, the state was not successful in increasing the number of legalized miners. And so, whereas I mentioned it that at the beginning, it seemed that coercive strategies were giving some result or decreasing the number of informal miners, in reality, what happened was that the miners persecuted spread out. The activity expanded to clandestine areas because the miners were running away from the state. And this brings us to the trade-off. The raids increased violence in local towns. Also, as the state cut all the possibilities for informal miners to work or to legalize their practices, miners developed associations with criminal groups in many cases or illegal groups that could provide them capital or credit to continue with their activities. Hence, in the mining towns, the situation worsened. So let's go over some of the main points of our argument and some of the lessons that we can draw from this study. First of all, we have tried to make the argument that cooperation is better than coercion, because by integrating the perspective of the people under regulations, the state is better equipped to develop feasible policies, feasible regulatory strategies, implementation strategies, and in particular to reduce resistance. Cooperation, the way we see it, implies commitment from the parties. By contrast, coercion might provide short-term goals, such as reducing the number of informal miners, but in the long run, it does not help the state to learn about the activity, gain the trust of the people that wants to regulate, meaning miners, or ensure compliance. And in fact, there is no evidence in Latin America or in general in the global south that coercive strategies have granted positive results. In many cases, such as Colombia or in general sub-Saharan Africa, coercion worsened existing problems of ASM. Having said that, I mentioned that none of the strategies are perfect, and they are not, because there are other requirements for the state to improve its power. So one of them for us to ensure effective regulation, we believe that, first of all, we need state presence on the ground. And presence as institutions, as personnel, signals commitment to regulate and affirm state authority. But a state presence also means to push for economic diversification in rural areas. Notice that the high power of the miner comes from the lack of alternatives at the local level. So creating opportunities for rural communities is a productive way to decrease the dependency on ASM. The second thing is that we're recommended to improve regulation is to develop deep knowledge on the activity hand in hand or in partnership with local actors. And to be clear, these are states, Bolivia and Peru, that have accumulated a lot of knowledge on the deposit, mineral quality, mineral prices, but they know very little about the actual living conditions and places where ASM takes place, especially in Peru. So the gap in knowledge prevents to develop feasible regulation. We recommend the state to develop this knowledge in partnership with local communities, local officials, members of civil society that understand and know better the local context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate and Zerai, for the presentation. We do have a number of questions here. So I was going to suggest that we go through a couple at a time, where I present maybe 2 or 3 questions at once, and then it gives you a chance to just each alternate between responding, sit with them a bit and think about them, and then order them, or go through them in order, and then take another round perhaps, and then we'll see where we're at in terms of time.
So should we choose the question?
Yeah, so I was going to start with a question on the model. I think would be an interesting place to start, and then we could dive into questions more specifically on the case studies. Mm-hmm. So beginning with the question here we have on the use of the classic kind of game theory insights, such as the prisoner's dilemma, to make sense of the larger questions. So it is this paper based largely on a two-player dynamic. So how far can we apply insights based on theory that assumes two players in contexts where there are many more types of players potentially, which include not just the state and the miners, but also local communities, other industries, including those that compete with artisanal and small-scale mining, civil society, political parties, and so forth. And a second follow-up question would be, how can the artisanal miners regulate their operations if all mineral deposits they discovered are in the hands of the large conventional mining companies? So, bringing in the first question, this speaks to, other actors that are involved. In this case, there would be a lot of issues around mining concessions and property rights and pressures like this. So let's start there, and then we'll visit some more of these questions.
Okay, do you want to take the question on the model first?
Yeah, so to get started, this is a great question, and I'm going to highlight that it's something that Zeta and I actually talked about a lot, the decision to simplify to two actors, because we are very aware of the fact that we have large-scale mining interest, environmental regulators' interest. We have the interest of other groups who may or may not partner with the miners. And the ultimate decision to simplify to two players was really to highlight that dynamic. So we are very aware of the limits to applying those insights, but I think there's a couple key places where we could actually factor other players into the existing model to apply it more generally. First, when we think about the miners' level of organization, we talked about this as a continuum. In the paper, we talk exclusively about the miners, but when we were debating our case studies, when we were talking about ways to highlight this theory, we also really discussed this idea of, do miners have partnerships with other groups who can help defend them? For example, we talked about potentially adding Colombia to the paper, cut it for space, but talked a lot about the role of armed actors in providing potential protection to miners. So while this isn't in the model, the same lesson travels because it's something that factors into their organization. If we have these partnerships with external actors by the miners, they are more organized in a lot of ways, or at least they have more capacity to fight against coercion. So that's one way that we could generalize despite the additional actors. The other point is that we do think that considering these larger dynamics would warrant a future research looking more at the end player dynamics, potentially bringing in some of the lessons we've learned from Bueno de Mesquita about complex bargaining spaces where we can account for the level of salience of different actors. That was beyond the scope of what we were hoping to tackle with this project, but I think it'd be a really important direction to move with our future work.
Yes, just to add to what Kate just said, I think, as she was saying, we discussed a lot about the model, but the idea, it's also, or the argument that we're presenting is also making the case to bring the two actors to the table. So one of the biggest challenges to regulate ASM in the world is that in many cases, miners do not have political representation. In many cases, the state doesn't know what happens in mining. So we are trying to, so we simplify this model and make them the two actors, because we want to dig into the incentives for them to cooperate, to sit together, to talk, and to establish some common ground, some rules. So the question about how can miners regulate their operations if almost all mineral deposits they discover are in the hands of large conventional mining companies. It is partially true, Marcelo, but I think this is one of the issues, for instance, that many policymakers don't know. many policymakers, in the case of Ecuador, in the case of Colombia, in the case of Peru, want the miners to comply with certain regulations, and miners respond, well, we don't even have the land titles, or we don't have permits, or we don't have any office next to us. So we think, and we're making the case, that for the parties to know, to develop feasible regulation, the first starting point is to sit together. And that means that the state should be willing to learn from not only the miners, but local communities and other groups, other stakeholders that are also impacted by mining.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, because I think that's really the lesson of the model, is our lesson was cooperation yields better results, but the implication of that lesson is the more you know, the quicker you can cooperate, the more effectively, and the more you can push for what the state's interests are, what the regulation ideals are. So if the miners are using these large scale deposits, and it's certainly possible, we talked about how a lot of people who turn to ASM are people who left conventional mining, that we can see it happen, we do see it happen, but if they don't know it's happening, then accounting for the relationship with large scale mining is impossible in the regulatory framework.
Okay, so now we'll move into a couple more related questions around the challenges, but also successes that ASM engagement between miners and the state might present. So one case that has been pointed out to us is in the case of Morocco, where there has been evidence and instances of collaboration between the state and artisanal small-scale mining operators, where the state has put out at their disposal a particular regulation and technical assistance to sell product and also to rationalize exploitation of deposits. So how might we rethink and generalize this success? And related to that, in these case studies in particular of Peru and Bolivia, what appears to be some of the technical capacity that is needed, not only to better regulate environmental practices, but also to support miners?
Thank you for the question. I will say that I'm interested in looking into the details of that case. And another a country case that we can think of that has that we have more evidence and that applies a cooperative strategy is the case of Guyana, where the state cooperates with the miners. And so the question was, how can we put this into practice? And I think one of the developments that we have seen in the region is as simple as create offices, decentralize the offices that regulate the activities, create trained personnel. Your state offices should know how ASM works, should know the details, the costs, the miners, the economy behind smaller scale mining. You should also have personnel to enforce the laws. It's very basic, but most of the countries in Latin America, if not all, lack that. And without state presence on the ground, it's very difficult to advance in regulation, in developing knowledge. But also, it is very difficult for miners to trust the state. You know? So on the other end, why should I comply? Why should I pay taxes? Why should I follow certain regulation to a state that I don't see? You know, so I think to begin with, that should be the starting point.
Okay, thank you. We have some more questions coming in. So I'll try to maybe present 2 to 3 and see where we can go from there. So, what is your take on coexistence? So the idea of large scale mining operations working with or even conceding some of their concessions to small scale miners. Has this been observed in any of these case studies? I know that internationally, this is something that often is brought up in other regional contexts. So that is the first question. The second question I wanted to ask is on the idea of illegality. And so in some cases, we see there's more conflation, as you said, between illegal activities and artisanal mining, whereas it becomes maybe less criminalized in other cases. So in these cases, have you seen instances of criminal enterprises, coercive actors factoring into the state's calculation about how to engage with ASM if there is illegal activity or illegal, let's say, ownership or illegal investment going into the mining sector or to the ASM mining sector? So let's start with those two for now.
Okay, so regarding coexistence, I think it's such a fascinating topic that I've been personally studying with Marcelo Vega here in the audience. And although it is out of the scope of our paper, it is I think one of the newest challenges around ASM in Latin America in particular. So basically, when we talk about coexistence, we talk about the presence of large scale and artisanal mining, and if they can't get into a sort of arrangement that can allow sometimes companies to buy the mineral from small scale mining, or to ensure that small scale mining can follow certain procedures or regulations. I think there are a couple of things to say about the issue, although it is although we're still making progress on that. What we observe at the local level is it's the problem that I mentioned before. Even if we find partnership between the two, between large scale and small scale mining, we still need state presence. So what we're seeing is that often they get, even when they have an arrangement, there are conflicts, there are other communities that are interested in the minerals, that want to invade, other actors, legal or illegal, that want to profit out of it. So even if we think about coexistence between larger scale and a smaller scale, that doesn't liberate or that doesn't free the state from its roles. On the other hand, or by contrast, I think even with coexistence, we need to strengthen state presence on the ground. Do you want to talk about illegality, Kate?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really good question. And some of this will be actually talking about some other work that ZIE is working on. But something that we think about a lot when we think about this issue of how criminal, clandestine, coercive actors factor into cooperation versus coercion is twofold. The first is in the state incentive structure to coerce. So in instances where we see greater evidence of working alongside other types of criminal actors, ones that the state needs to signal their ability to tackle, for example, as a major goal. They are worried about this. It's important for signaling state strengths. We see a greater temptation to turn to coercive action. That is, when we talked a little bit about this trade-off of the short-term benefits of coercion versus the longer time horizons associated with cooperation, the more that we see the involvement of criminal clandestine actors, the more it takes for the state to essentially overcome that desire and that need to coerce. It's something that we think is incredibly important for understanding why, despite the fact that we see these stronger outcomes in cooperation, it's so hard to actually see it happening. Then where ZIE's work has gone is she is actively working on questions of under what conditions do these informal actors turn from informality towards illegality. And this question is another way that factors into when and why might coercion be effective. Based on our model, coercion is less effective, but based on models we've started thinking about toying with as extensions to the work, we see instances where it might be less optimal, but it might be more rational. And I think that's where the question of illegality becomes incredibly important to factor in.
Okay, thank you. Couple of questions here on the specific cases from the paper. So diving a little bit more into the political and institutional capacities of Bolivia and Peru to tackle some of these challenges. So a couple of the questions here have discussed the environmental challenges, as well as challenges of dependency on mineral exports in general, but also for regions on artisanal small-scale mining. So given the quite different political makeups of each country, where in one case the cooperative model certainly is present and has some past engagements and social mobilizations against the government, that might not necessarily translate into the Peruvian context. So do you think this development of like cooperative strategies would work in the case of Peru? And just building off of this context, asking a larger question about even if there were to be more robust regulations and royalty frameworks and fiscal models where public revenues could be increased through a more cohesive model of cooperation with ASM, would that be a good solution, or does it kind of just continue down the road of dependency upon the mineral sector in both cases, and would diversification of the economy ultimately be a longer term aim?
Yes, thank you. So let's talk about the first question on if cooperation works in Peru. I actually think that they're very similar. They're very similar cases. Does cooperation work in Peru? Well, certainly coercion hasn't. If we know something for sure, is that coercion does not work. And I forgot to say, but every police and military operation raids in Peru costs like $300,000. It's very expensive. So you will need to have to have a special budget and trained police and military to constantly do these operations in order to see compliance. And even with that level of coercion, it hasn't really yielded positive results. On the other hand, what I'm saying, or what we were arguing, is that although both cases have huge problems and none of them are ideal, cooperating, meaning learning, sitting on the table, discussing regulation, leads to better outcomes. It is more productive. And so how can we think about this? How can we make this real if we are thinking about the case of Peru? One of the progress that we have made in the case of Peru is to sit with the associations, with the miners' associations, something that was impossible in the past. Another one is to gather their ideas on the improvements, because miners have also developed certain technology to improve their practices? Are we adopting that, or are we asking for very expensive technology that obviously an informal miner will not be able to afford it? What are the costs of legalization, the real formal ones and the hidden costs of legalization? All of these things can only be learned if the state sits with these associations. And at the subnational level, in another study that is going to be soon out, I find that where there has been cooperation at the subnational level, there are more results. There are better results for legalization. This is the case of Ayacucho, where also miners have formed large and strong associations. So we have evidence at the subnational level that cooperation can provide a better avenue than coercion. Sorry, there's a little bit of background noise. You can go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, sorry. So making sure that we've answered the full question. So to what extent does cooperation translate? In terms of diversification and the way that they address the different types of deposits, I think that what this does is it changes the challenges that the state face, or essentially the upfront cost of what it means to cooperate. So when we think about the more diverse, the more that needs to be learned, the more information gathered on the one hand by the state. But I also think it's really important to note that, as we've talked about a little bit in the presentation, diversifying access for rural communities to different industries, to expanding sectors, to opportunities would be one of the key ways to break essentially this cycle of challenges of a need for regulation, a desire to regulate, but an ultimate failure to regulate because of lack of aligning incentives, a lack of concern about what it means to actually regulate an industry without harming people's livelihoods, something that we've talked a little bit about, but that I think it's important to reiterate here is we're worried about the negative effects of ASM. States are worried about the negative effects. Environmental groups are worried about the negative effects, but it's also people's livelihoods. And just as much as worrying about how to regulate is how to provide opportunities and alternatives, and making sure that regulatory frameworks don't come without these options of alternative mechanisms to still achieve independence.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time. So I just have one final question for us to end on with the couple minutes that we have left, and then we will say goodbye for today. If anybody has to jump out right at the very top of the hour, I would just like to say right away, thank you very much. But in this last question, I was interested in discussing international compliance, and in particular, the policy recommendations of the paper. I noticed there isn't like a specific call to international engagement with attempts to standardize best practices. So one example being the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. In these cases, is there any empirical basis for international standards playing a role here moving forward? And are there any robust attempts that you've seen in these cases or elsewhere to create standardization in the ASM sector? And I bring this up in the context also of the fact that the Canadian government, as one question points out, has been very active through Global Affairs Canada and other international engagements in funding best practices and improving standards in the ASM sector. So that's the last question for today, and I'll leave it to you each to address.
Okay, as I said, do you want to start or do you want me to start?
You can start if you want.
I'll start with the full warning that because we have not looked at that specific question empirically, and we've really been focused on state level and local level, that this is conjecture and opinion more than firm fact. But I'm of two minds about it personally. And the first is I think that these international standards, international regulatory frameworks are incredibly important. I, like many of you, was up very late this week learning about what was happening at climate conferences figuring out offsetting emissions. And I think in that sense that these are incredibly important tools for how the state thinks about what their goals are and how to regulate. But I think it's most effective with large scale mining, particularly because of the international nature of that sector, the way that trade takes place, the goals around it. I think when we're looking at these artisanal small scale mining communities, while having those are useful for the states in designing the policy, I don't know that they can help with implementation as much as the building trust, building knowledge, and investing in long-term strategies that span the political spectrum. We mentioned very briefly this idea that it's not necessarily about left-right politics, and I stand by that. I think ZIE stands by it, but I do think it's worth noting that political motivations when enforcing cannot be overstated. Different groups, different parties are going to have different goals in what signals they want to send with their choices to enforce that make them more or less likely to cooperate. So having these international standards, one of the ways that they could be most beneficial in translating down to this thing that seems to work best at the most local level is in creating a uniform framework to help align the goals and reduce the political pressures that might lead to pursuing less effective regulatory policies.
Yes, just to add an example to Kate's point. So one of the examples of international regulation that we have is the Kyoto Protocol that regulates mercury use. And so a lot of countries, especially resource-dependent countries, signed compliance to reduce mercury levels, mercury use, and mercury trade. And Peru, for instance, was one of those. And it committed to reduce the use of mercury, which is very important in gold mining. You use mercury to get gold. And so what it did is, in these police and military raids, ensure and cut all the possibilities to buy mercury for miners, especially in mining towns. But again, our point that we need to know how it works. We need to know about local conditions. We need to know what the activity is and how it works. It comes across here because by doing so, the Peruvian market then started to buy more, the black market started to sell more mercury illegally in Peru. So now, yes, formally we reduce our mercury standards, but we have more mercury due to the black market. So that means that we cannot think about unilateral solutions, but they have to come hand in hand with partnership with local actors.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody again for attending today. I know that I was very much looking forward to the conversation based on this paper. And this paper, if you haven't had a chance yet to read it, is available at policyschool.ca/publications. It was just released yesterday, but this has been a work in progress for several months. So Zoraie and Catherine, thank you very much for all your hard work, and I've really enjoyed seeing it all come together. And one last time to the audience, thank you very much for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
And go Canada.
Yes.